The topic is the harvest. The topic is also still the maintenance, of the crops. Right now we have the first tomatoes coming in, cherry tomatoes. And then we have different types of tomato varieties. We have cucumbers, zucchinis, lettuces, still plenty of herbs, and there are edible flowers. The topic is weeding, to try to make sure that there aren't too many weeds taking over. Before, we had mulched our crops quite a lot, so we're able to limit the growth of weeds a bit. We also mulch to help the soil stay cool and moist. And in these times of heat waves, well, that's really valuable. The sun is abundant. We water our crops with drip irrigation. We try to water as little as possible, but we still do water them. And so there are also weeds that grow. So we have to try to keep that under control. We use a tool called a market garden hoe, which is quite well designed. I have several attached tools that allow me to adapt the use of my tool to the crop bed. For young bean seedlings, I use a tool that lets me avoid weeding the beans themselves, but weeds around them. We regularly sow new lettuce. We still do a few more bean sowings. We can still sow beets as well. It's really kind of the end. We'll really start sowing again more towards the end of August. There's also the matter of watering, making sure that, well, there aren't any plants suffering from a lack of water. And it's also the beginning of certain diseases. We have to keep an eye on that. We're starting to see powdery mildew appear on some zucchini and cucumber leaves. We also have cabbage white butterflies starting to do some damage to the cabbages. We try to limit the damage a bit by quickly removing the leaves affected by powdery mildew, for example, on zucchinis, cucumbers, and also Swiss chard. What we do is ventilate the greenhouse very often as well. And then we try to limit watering on the foliage. We also do some treatments with plant manure, typically horsetail, to limit powdery mildew. Or we also use comfrey manure, which can be useful for stimulating fruiting. Another mistake that can be made quite easily with tomatoes, for example, is not cleaning the pruning shears or your hands enough when moving from one area to another. Because when the first diseases appear, like blight and so on, they spread quite quickly. So you have to be careful about that. In July, there is also crop monitoring. So for some plants, like tomatoes, for example, we remove what are called suckers to try to limit the growth of the tomato plants. And above all, to make sure that most of the energy goes into the fruits. We remove a lot of suckers specifically to try to limit diseases. And so the idea is really to try to make sure that air circulates as much as possible in there. Something else that can be interesting to do, especially if you haven't sown many tomatoes, is to propagate tomato suckers. You propagate them in water, so you let the tomato stem develop a new root system. In 2 or 3 weeks, roots of 1 to 2 centimeters will have formed. At that point, you can transplant them directly into the ground or repot them. You'll have tomatoes in August, September. There's also staking the tomatoes. You need to help them grow. We tie them up a lot to optimize space. And we support the tomato plant, the cucumber plant, all climbing plants as they reach for the sky. There are several techniques for staking. We use the structure of the greenhouse to stretch cables, which then allow us to tie up strings or spools. And with clips, we guide the tomato stem along this string. It's very practical, very simple, and you can reuse it every year. And then outside, I use the walls a lot. So I plant quite a few tomatoes along the walls. Plus, it's interesting because the wall acts as a thermal mass. And when that's not possible, we make our own little framework with bamboo. It's a bit of DIY, but it works. What you need to stake tomatoes is a string. So it's possible to gradually wind the tomato stem around the string as it grows. This is a pretty simple technique, and it doesn't harm the plant. Then there are the clips. These are perfect because the tomato stem can thrive inside and will have the chance to grow without being restricted by a knot or anything like that. I think one of the mistakes I make with tomatoes is maybe watering them too much. Tomatoes actually like to suffer a little, specifically from water stress. That's what makes them taste better. They need warmth, sunlight, but also not too much watering. Of course, you do need to water them a bit, otherwise you'll notice it quickly. The leaves will wilt, and you'll see there's a lack of water. I think watering once a week is enough, but then again, it really depends on the climate. It could also be twice a week. I'm still not precise enough with my irrigation system to isolate certain areas and so on. Since we also do a lot of companion planting with the tomatoes, I have basil, lettuce, and other plants that do need watering. So that's the challenge with a fairly complex companion planting system. When it comes to harvesting, it's important to handle the fruits carefully so they don't get damaged and can be stored for longer. We make sure to pick and place the tomatoes, zucchinis, and other fruits gently. We also weigh everything carefully to actually know what the farm's productivity is. We're in a system where we don't store anything. Only the zucchinis and cucumbers need to be harvested every 2 days because they grow a lot. Otherwise, we store very little. What we do store, we keep in a fridge, and each week we basically sell off the production, harvesting it the very same morning. We actually have no waste at all. Because if there is any, it's given to the team or to the chickens.